Today we're going to be talking about Ontario's land use planning policies. So we've been talking about these intermittently throughout the year. We're going to be going through the actual documents today. So, anybody have an idea of how land use planning works in Ontario? Yeah.
They have like different areas like categorized into zones as like for like agriculture, or for like commercial use, or for like residential living. So you can only build certain things in those areas.
Right. So zoning is one aspect of land use planning, but it's not all that there is to land use planning, and it's not even set by the province. Okay. So first I'll draw you a little schematic of how zoning works, or land use planning works. So we have the province, we've got the Planning Act. That's Ontario. Planning Act gives cities the right to make their own local plans. Okay? The province, we say cities in Ontario, cities are a creature of the province. Creature is a legal creature. They only have the rights that the province gives them. So we have the Planning Act, which is a piece of legislation, and then that gives power to the cities to create their own plans. So we have a plan for a city is called an official plan. Official plan. The city of Toronto has an official plan. The city of Guelph has an official plan. Oakville has an official plan. Burlington has an official plan. We'll be looking at those a little bit. So we have the official plan, but we also have some other things. There's something called the Provincial Policy Statements, called the PPS. We call it the PPS. And then we also have some other plans that the province creates. For example, the Greenbelt plan, the growth plans for the Golden Horseshoe, several of these, about half dozen of these. We call these other Prov plans. There's a relationship between the three of these. Everything must be consistent with the Planning Act. Consistent. I'll be telling you what that means with the Planning Act. The official plan must also be OP, we call this. The OP must also be consistent with other plans. I'm sorry, I didn't say inconsistent. Conform. With this dotted line, official plan must be consistent with the PPS, Provincial Policy Statement. So we got consistency, and then we got conforming. You have to conform with the provincial plans, and then consistent with the policy statements. Conform with the provincial plans, consistent with the policy statements. Okay? Who knows, who can guess what the differences between conform and consistency is? What would it mean to conform? What would it mean to be consistent with? Yes?
Conform could mean to change in order to be like something else.
Okay, and then what would be consistent?
Consistent would be being, or just staying the same, like not changing, but like still applying.
So conform would be shifting to something else, becoming something else. Consistent means staying the same. Any other ideas? Okay, so these are legal concepts. To conform means they cannot contradict one another, and there's a strict legal understanding of what contradiction means. So if the official plan says you can't do something, or sorry, if the provincial plan says you can't do something, the official plan can't say you can't do that. Or if the provincial growth plan says you have to have commercial housing within 800 meters of a metro station, then you can't say you only have commercial housing, commercial buildings within 100 meters. No. Why? So conform means that. Be consistent with. The problem is the provincial policy statement is more vague, so consistency is more vague criteria as well. So the PPS sets out some vague policy goals and objectives, and then the official plans have to take that into consideration. For example, the PPS, the provincial policy statement for Ontario, says that we have to, cities have to allow for mixed-use housing. It doesn't say where, it doesn't say how much, it doesn't say with what intensity. So we've got the city of Toronto saying, okay, we've got 3% of the city ready for mixed use, and that's it. We're not consistent with the PBS. Zoning bylaws come from the official plan. ZBL, zoning bylaws. Zoning bylaws have to conform with the official plan. Zoning bylaws are just one part of the official plan. They're not the whole thing. We'll be going through a couple. Before we do that, though, let's talk about the history of planning. So, talking about zoning right now, let me just make a distinction between zoning and the building code. Who thinks they know what the distinction is between zoning and the building code? Yes?
Wouldn't zoning be what can be built, and the code would be how it should be built?
That's a great way of putting it. Zoning is what you can build. The building code is how you can build. People like to say that the history of the zoning code, well, zoning in general, goes back to ancient times, where you had even the Code of Hammurabi and other ancient, like thousands of years old, legislations by kings, declarations saying what stones you can use to build a house, etc. And then in the English realm, it was the very first mayor of London, Fitzalan, something Fitzalan. He came up with a when he first became mayor, he was declared mayor of London in the year 1100-ish. His first thing was to say what you can build, or how you can build your houses in London, especially if you're sharing a wall, especially how tall you can build that house, etc. It's kind of a mix. We didn't get zoning proper until in North America at least, until the very late 1800s. The first one was in a little town called Modesto, California. I think I've been over this, where they said, we've got some they declared we're going to split up the city into residential and commercial areas. And residential areas, you can only have one family per house, and you're not allowed to build laundromats in your house. Why would they say that? Why would they make that specific rule? Yeah.
Maybe like the area of their building wasn't properly, like, didn't have proper drainage for contamination from laundry soap and such.
That's a good idea. They didn't have the proper drainage. But anybody else have another idea? Yeah.
They didn't want the sort of people who wanted to have laundromats.
They didn't want the sort of people who didn't have laundromats. Who could that be? I'll tell you who. In Modesto, California, they had a large Chinese population, and they had multiple families living in one house, and at the bottom of their house, they had a laundromat. The other people in Modesto, California didn't like the Chinese coming in here with their multiple families and their laundromats, so they made a rule that said one family per house, no laundromats. New York got the idea a few years later. Somebody was going to build the first skyscraper in New York, and people were complaining nearby. It's like, oh, the shadows, our precious shadows in New York City. We don't want skyscrapers. They took that to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said it's okay. But you have to make some sort of trade-off. So they said, you can build up as tall as you want, but you gotta be careful for shadows. So what did they do? They came up with something called the setback requirements. Who knows what a setback requirements is? Yeah.
How far back from the road a building can be built?
So that's one thing. So you have one kind of setback. So this is going to be an aerial view. So if this is your property line, these are your property lines. Setback requirements say how far back from your property lines you're allowed to build. So it might be like 10 meters. So there'll be an invisible box. You're only allowed to build in that one box. There's another sort of setback, which says when you're building up, you have to set back your building so that it casts less of a shadow. So this is the aerial view. And then here's a side view. You have a building, and then, you ever seen buildings that go up like that? Take little steps up. This is the buildings that used to look like this. A lot of people think they look like this for fun. But sometimes they'll even be symmetrical the other side too, right? Why wouldn't a builder want to build like this? Yeah.
Because you're using the rectangle space. Like you could, if you're renting out that space, you could like be using income from.
Exactly correct. All this area, you could have built homes and offices. You'd be increasing the supply of homes and offices. And if you're increasing the supply of homes and offices, what's that going to do to the price of homes and offices? Going to bring them down. But people are worried about shadows, so they say, oh, let's require buildings, if they're tall, they gotta come inside. Questions so far? If you get involved in zoning conversations a lot, you'll hear something called, from Americans, you'll hear something called Euclidean zoning. Anyone have a guess as to what Euclidean zoning is? Euclidean zoning has to do with Euclid. So an amateur might think this has something to do with Euclid, who wrote the elements of mathematics. Has to do with the geometries or something. Not quite. There was a town called Euclid, and they were the first town to have, or to be taken to court over their zoning map, which I'll show you some examples now. Their zoning map carved out the city into different residential and commercial and industrial, etc. So, the city of Toronto didn't get zoning until the 1950s. Here is a news article from it says at the top, July 9, 1920, from the Globe. You've heard of the Globe and Mail? Before, it used to be just called the Globe, and then there was another newspaper called the Mail, and they merged to become the Globe and Mail. 1920, they were just called the Globe. The need of zoning law in 1922. When they talked about the need of zoning law, they weren't worried about brothels opening up next to daycares, which is what a lot of people talk about when they worry about zoning. It's like, oh, we need to protect our daycares from brothels. They're not even worried about drainage issues or a few days ago we had someone asking about transit capability, etc. It was just about preserving property values. From 1920, they understood supply and demand. They said if you restrict the supply in a growing city, prices will go up. Easy. It took another 30 years for someone to do something about this. So we got the 1950, let me see if I got that one. So 1952 we had, the zoning was passed in Toronto. This is an article from a couple of years later. The principle should prevail. The Canadian Railroad Company was going to build a rail yard next to a residential area. And people were complaining that this is against the zoning bylaw. But the railroad said the Planning Act gives us a right to override whatever local zoning bylaw you have. And the article goes on to say that the railroads aren't the only ones who have that right. We have the Department of National Defense and Veterans Affairs, the Provincial Department of Highways, the Ontario Hydro Conservation Authorities, school boards, and certain special boards like the Toronto and York Road Commission. All have exemptions over whatever the local zoning bylaw is, so they can just come in and say, we want to build whatever we want here, and the city can't do anything about it, the neighbors can't do anything about it. Remember our discussion from last week? Talking about people being exempt, talking about all the different agencies who can expropriate land. These are some of those agencies. And they can do with the land whatever they wish. They can do with the land whatever they wish because that's what the law allows for them. Well, the legislation. Let's talk about this article. Zoning conserves values. Oh, that should have been done by the old ones. Zoning law divides the Annex. So the Annex is a part of the city of Toronto, near the University of Toronto. There was debate. So at the time, there were a lot of so-called rooming houses. A rooming house was basically a dormitory for adults and for anyone who wanted a room. There were small rooms, shared kitchen. The article says that someone wanted to build a rooming house, and the local residents said that we don't want this rooming house, and there was a big fight at the public hearing. And we got quotes from the Toronto Rooming House Authority or Association, which was an association of other people building rooming houses in Toronto. And the article close to hand is saying most of the annex is already rooming houses in order to have places to live for the students of U of T and the professors. And the non-rooming house residents make up maybe 1/3 of the people who live in the annex, but they're the loudest voices. This is 1952. You had a question in the back? No? Pardon me?
You answered it.
Okay. So in 1952, people were complaining about how a small but very vocal group was overriding what the rest of the neighborhood could do. So here is the official plan for the city of Toronto. This is only chapters 1 to 5, and it's already 180 pages. So we go through this official plan. This talks about how it's got a lot of pictures. It's loading very slowly. It's because it's got a lot of pictures about what they want the city to look like. I want to go to chapter 4. So it comes up with all these policies. So here we've got a policy for heritage conservation districts. And it lists some policies, and then the city of Toronto, the municipality, whenever heritage conservation situation comes up, they have to consult with the official plan, and they say, okay, what does the official plan say that we have to do with this situation? The official plan for the city of Toronto also defines views, and then it has a list at the bottom, I'd show you if it wasn't so slow, of all the structures in the city that count as a view. And then new buildings that block views, they have to follow certain guidelines. And a few years ago, there was some city councilors saying that if your apartment, if your condo is facing a view, you should pay a higher tax. So they define all sorts of things, and policies get made around this. The city of Guelph also has an official plan. Here's the city of Guelph's official plan. This is 400 pages, but it's very similar to Toronto's. It's not as nicely put together, but it's the same thing in that it has different policies, what the objectives of the policy, and then the rules that they should follow, etc. So I mentioned that the official plan is where the zoning bylaw comes from. Let me pull up the zoning map for the city of Toronto. So here is just one map, and this is the city of Toronto. The yellow on this map represents what I call the yellow belt, and those are residential. Those are the residential zones in the city of Toronto. You can only build residential areas. So the first one is all the residential zones. And the second one at the bottom, that's just residential detached. So legally, you're only allowed to build detached zoning in the second map. On the other one is anything up to 4 stories as a residential only apartment. But, here's actually a fun mapping question for you. In this top map, how much of that map would you say is yellow? Let me flip it around so we make it bigger. much of this map? $60? Who says more than 65? Who says more than 50? Most of you are saying more than 50. It's actually, anyone says like less than 50? Anyone says less than 40? More than 70? Yeah. It's actually 48%. 48%. Why? It's because, first of all, this map is a projection of a 3D sphere. Second of all, you see all these tiny little dots in this map? Those add up. Those really add up. So you got to be careful when it comes to eyeballing the area of a map. Yeah.
Would those like not yellow spaces also be counted as like parks?
Yeah, so the rest of that is parks and industrial zones and commercial zones. Here is here's the zoning map for the city of Guelph. You see most of it up here is yellow. A lot of it is green. And then the blue areas are for industry. Questions? Questions about what's going on right now? So I mentioned that that bigger map represented all of the residential zones, which include not just for detached homes, but also townhomes, semi-detached homes, and the so-called multi-residential homes. Here's just a statistical breakdown of the different areas of the city. But this section here is just a cutout from the official plan for Toronto. And it talks about the need for preserving the physical character of buildings, of neighborhoods. And it's this section here, can't really read it, but it's this section here where they talk about that any new development has to preserve the physical character of existing developments. Because this is the official plan, this overrides the zoning bylaw. The zoning bylaw has to conform with the official plan. So if the zoning bylaw says you have a neighborhood full of detached homes, and then the zoning bylaw comes in and says, okay, let's zone this area now for townhomes. And then somebody comes in and says, okay, I want to build a townhome here. Neighbors can complain, take it to the planning board, and then they'll point to this section of the official plan and say, hey, this isn't conforming with the official plan. It's not preserving the physical character. Townhomes don't preserve the character of detached homes. And then it'll get shut down. And it's happened a lot. Happens all the time. You got a question in the back?
Just like people also get exemptions from zoning bylaws, so like.
Excellent. So you can get an exemption from the zoning bylaw. You can get an exemption from the zoning bylaw. That's accounted for in the Planning Act. The Planning Act has a section called Section 37, which says if you would like to get an exemption from the zoning bylaw, or we call that, you want to change the zoning bylaw. You can do this through a formal process, and it's very tedious, etc., difficult. It takes multiple years to get through a zoning amendment process, as we call it. Part of that zoning amendment process, in Toronto at least, the city council, and everywhere here, the city council gets to ask you for some monetary compensation in order to change the zoning bylaw? What limit do you think there is on how much money the city can ask for changing the zoning bylaw? Who's got a guess? Yeah.
Would it just be like whatever they think the citizens will pay them without like aggressive like protest or revolt?
Interesting answer. There is no official limit to how much money they can ask for. There's no official limit to how much money the city can ask for in exchange for amending the zoning bylaw. Does anyone see any economic problems here in the back?
How is this different than a brag?
That's a great question, actually. I was in a meeting with provincial planners and some other business leaders and lawyers, etc. And one of the lawyers who represented foreign clients said that American companies can't come into Toronto to develop because they're worried that Section 37 might legally be a bribe, which is against American laws. So they're saying we're getting fewer American developers in Toronto because they're worried that this is a bribe. Legally, this would be construed as a bribe. Yeah?
Another problem could be if the town, say Toronto, charges too much, then people of lower economic status won't be able to voice their opinions and change zoning laws.
So that's one issue. Let's just talk about the strict economics, though. What incentives does the city have if there is no legal limit to how much they can ask for in terms of a fee for their zoning amendment change? Got an idea?
Depending on how much money, like it would look good in the election, it's like your city's running a deficit, you get a bunch of money, like while you're in term.
Yeah. So they do that. There is a document that the City of Toronto makes public, which lists all the things that they have spent Section 37 money on. I think it stops at 2018 because they made some changes, but it goes back to, I want to say the early 90s, maybe late 80s. And all sorts of things come up on what the city spends the money on. A lot of it is little parks. A lot of it is public art. Who's heard of the Shangri-La Hotel in Toronto? So it's one of the fanciest hotels in the city. When that went up, the City of Toronto, for their Section 37 money, they said, among other things, they said 1% of your gross construction costs you have to spend on public art. It costs hundreds of millions of dollars to build the Shangri-La Hotel. And they had to spend 1% of their money, of the gross construction costs, on art. Do you think the local artists are in favor or oppose Section 37?
I think they'd be in favor because that means there's a lot more demand.
Yeah. If you ever drive by the Shangri-La Hotel, you'll notice that there's this gigantic silver structure, kind of looks like an elephant made out of birds. It's not clear what it is, but that's what they spent their money on. There's also this issue where if you're a city and you know that you can charge extra money for your for zoning amendments, are you likely to zone appropriately or slightly below what the market really demands? I think you guys can figure it out. You're going to under-zone, right? So if you know that most people in the downtown core want to build 50, 60 stories, you'll only zone it to 20 stories. And then now somebody comes along and says, we want to build something with 50 stories. You guys say, oh, you want to you want to amend the zoning bylaw? Pay up. Yeah.
Wouldn't that also mean it'll always be?
Quiet, please.
Wouldn't that mean it'll always be in the city's best interest to change the code?
Yeah.
Because they can always like cover their transaction costs.
Yes. So that's why we have a backlog of developers in Toronto trying to amend the zoning bylaw. And it takes years to get through one. It takes many years to amend the zoning bylaw because everybody's trying to do it. Yes?
Can amendments run contradictory to the official provincial plan?
No. All the zoning bylaw always has to be, always has to conform with the official plan, which has to conform with the provincial plans. Yes?
Couldn't they also like abuse it by just setting the price too high to ever really let anybody change things?
So there is no price, right? It's just a fee, and it's a government set fee, and it's totally arbitrary. It changes project to project. I know of a development that was going to happen at the corner of Yonge and Queen, which is where the Eaton Center is in Toronto. Very busy place. There's a subway station there, a lot of office buildings there. It's a very happening place. Someone was going to build a purpose-built rental apartment building on that corner. Rumor has it that the city councilor responsible for that area said that I'll let you build this purpose-built rental building only if you give me, well, the city, $20 million in cash. What do you think the developer did? Developer got out. Said, I don't want to develop anymore. Instead, what we're getting on that corner in Toronto is a brick furniture store. So it's good for the brick, bad for anyone who wanted to live in that area. So this could be prohibitive. Yeah.
So would, like, I'm not sure how big a lobbyist or like someone like this is single in the city level, would have influence on like these kind of jurisdictions. But if a lobbyist was to come in and kind of like influence those city politicians to like make those fees so high that your ideas and pleasant for this one and then that spot, would that be something like this? Well, okay, I like, for instance, if I don't want
Guys, quiet, please.
if I don't want housing built in like this really industrial area, and if someone wants to come in and build housing in that spot and the zoning bylaw, like if I'm a lobbyist and I incentivize like city planners or whatever to set that price so incredibly high that it incentivizes them, that's something that can and does happen.
Yeah, it happens. Those are remember those old people I showed you? Those are the lobbyists who have the most power at the city council. They're always lobbying for less development. And then you go to the meetings for those politicians where all those old people show up, and the politicians will get up on the desk and say, I love you guys, thank you so much for coming, here's all the great things I've done for you, I stopped this development here, I extracted so much money from that development there. They brag, they show off, because they know that's who the real boss is. It's not like the US where it's some billionaire pharmaceutical pulling the strings. In the city of Toronto, at least, who's really pulling the strings are those old people in charge, residential associations. All right, see you guys on Monday.